In early 2017, a terrifying crime spree swept across Florida and Alabama. At the center of the storm were two unlikely partners, Billy Boyette, a violent career criminal, and Mary Rice, a woman whose role in the carnage remains one of the most debated questions in this chilling case. Was she a victim or a willing accomplice? This is the story of their deadly trail. For more videos like this, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Before the deadly manhunt, before his name became synonymous with fear across the Gulf Coast, Billy Boyette was just another boy growing up in the Deep South. But what turned this small-town kid into one of Florida's most dangerous spree killers? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning. William Billy Eugene Boyette Jr. was born in Florida in 1978. The details of his childhood are scarce, but what is known paints a picture of instability. Growing up in poverty, surrounded by drugs and dysfunction, Boyette's early years were marked by turmoil. Teachers described him as restless, prone to anger, and easily influenced by the wrong crowd. As he moved into his teenage years, that anger began to manifest in dangerous ways. He got into fights, skipped school, and brushed up against the law more than once before reaching adulthood. For many, these were red flags. But in small towns where resources were limited, Billy's troubles slipped through the cracks. As a young adult, Boyette's criminal career escalated. Arrest records show a pattern of assault, theft, drugs. Each offense painted a clearer picture. Billy was violent, unpredictable, and increasingly dangerous. His drug use, particularly methamphetamine, fed his paranoia and aggression. Friends and girlfriends would later describe a man who could be charming one moment and terrifyingly violent the next. When he was sober, Billy could be sweet, but when he was using, you didn't want to be around him. You never knew what would set him off. Over the years, Boyette developed a disturbing pattern. He was controlling, especially toward women. Many of his domestic violence arrests came from partners who were too afraid to leave. And when they did leave, Boyette often retaliated. Police reports detailed terrifying accounts. Women beaten, threatened, stalked. In some cases, Boyette would hold them hostage in their own homes, refusing to let them leave. These weren't isolated incidents, they were a cycle of abuse that lasted decades. Every time we dealt with Boyette, it was the same story. Violence against women, drugs, weapons. We knew he was dangerous. The problem was, unless someone was willing to testify against him, our hands were tied. Despite his long criminal record, Boyette often avoided serious prison time. Like many abusers, his victims were too terrified to face him in court. And so, the cycle continued. Psychologists who studied men like Boyette describe a classic pattern: narcissism, violent tendencies, and dependency on drugs. But Boyette also had a knack for manipulation. He could convince people, especially vulnerable women, that he was their protector, even as he destroyed their lives. This duality made him especially dangerous. To some, he was just Billy, a friend, a boyfriend, a father. To others, he was a ticking time bomb. Throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, Boyette spent time in and out of prison. Each stint seemed to harden him more. Instead of rehabilitation, prison only deepened his resentment toward the system, and he came out each time angrier than before. By the 2010s, Boyette was no longer just a repeat offender. He was a career criminal with nothing to lose, and that made him especially lethal. Just months before his killing spree, Boyette had already been implicated in violent assaults. In one case, he was accused of kidnapping and beating a woman for hours. Police knew he was spiraling, but he still walked free. "He won't let me leave. He's going to kill me." Warnings like these were flashing red lights, but the system failed to stop him before it was too late. By 2016, Billy Boyette was primed for destruction. A violent past, a history of abusing women, a drug problem that fueled paranoia, and a resentment for law enforcement that made him reckless. All he needed was a spark, and that spark would come in the form of Mary Rice. Billy Boyette didn't become a spree killer overnight. His crimes were a progression decades in the making. To understand the chaos that would follow, we first have to understand the man who created it. When the news broke in early 2017 that Billy Boyette wasn't acting alone, The name Mary Rice shocked many people who knew her. She wasn't a career criminal. She wasn't violent. She was a mother, a friend, and to those who loved her, someone who seemed unlikely to end up on a week-long killing spree. But the question remains, was Mary Rice another victim of Boyette's manipulation, or was she a willing accomplice? Mary's life began in stark contrast to Boyette's. Raised in the small town of Bruton, Alabama, she came from a working-class family. Friends described her as shy, soft-spoken, and family-oriented. She wasn't the kind of person people expected to make headlines. Mary wasn't a bad person. She was quiet, maybe a little too trusting, but she loved her family and her kids. That's who she was. Like many women in her situation, Mary's adult life wasn't easy. A single mother, she juggled work, bills, and raising children. Over time, she struggled with poverty, poor relationships, and low self-esteem. These vulnerabilities combined with a need for stability made her susceptible to someone like Billy Boyette. Mary and Billy's paths crossed in Florida. For Mary, he seemed exciting, dangerous, but protective. For Billy, Mary was someone he could control. Their connection was immediate, but to outsiders, it seemed toxic from the start. Boyette's charisma masked his volatility. To Mary, he may have felt like a shield from the hardships of her life, but that protection would soon come at an unimaginable cost. This is classic coercive control. Abusers isolate their victims, cut them off from friends and family, and create a psychological prison. To an outsider, Mary's choices may seem irrational, but to someone trapped in Boyette's orbit, they may have felt like the only option. Friends noticed that after meeting Boyette, Mary became more withdrawn. She was rarely seen without him. Whether out of fear or loyalty, she fell deeper under his influence. When the spree began, Mary was by Boyette's side. Together, they traveled across state lines, stealing cars and hiding in motels. Some witnesses described her as silent, almost robotic, while Boyette barked commands, but she stayed with him, even when chances to escape were there. This is where the debate intensifies. Was she paralyzed by fear, or was she complicit? During the trial, prosecutors painted a damning picture. They argued that Mary Rice had every opportunity to flee or seek help. Instead, they said, she aided Boyette, helping him steal vehicles, buy supplies, and evade capture. Mary Rice was not a hostage. She was a partner. She chose to stand by Billy Boyette as he murdered innocent women. But the defense told a different story. They described Mary as another victim, too terrified to run, too broken to resist. They argued that every step she took beside Boyette was under the constant threat of violence. That wasn't the Mary we knew. She wasn't a killer. I think she was scared for her life. Her family was torn. Some defended her as a woman caught in an impossible situation. Others admitted they struggled to reconcile the Mary they knew with the crimes she was linked to. In 2018, Mary Rice was convicted of accessory charges and sentenced to life in prison. The judge acknowledged her difficult past, but stressed the severity of her role in aiding Boyette's spree. With that decision, Mary's fate was sealed. To this day, the debate continues. Some see her as a cold accomplice who chose Boyette over innocent lives. Others view her as a battered woman whose fear dictated her every move. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but one fact is undeniable. Mary Rice's life, like the lives of Boyette's victims, was forever destroyed. Mary Rice's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about choice, control, and complicity. Was she a participant in Billy Boyette's violence or just another casualty of it? In the end, her name is forever linked to his. And for the families of the victims, the distinction may never matter. The story of Billy Boyette and Mary Rice took a violent turn at the Emerald Sands in Milton, Florida. What unfolded inside those motel walls marked the beginning of a killing spree that would grip the Southeast in fear, leaving families shattered and law enforcement scrambling against time. Alicia Greer was just 30 years old, a young mother, full of life, but also entangled in a complicated and dangerous relationship with Billy Boyette. He was abusive, controlling, and volatile, a man known for his violent temper. Despite the warnings from friends and family, Alicia remained connected to him. It's a story we've seen too often. Love and fear tangled together in a web of manipulation and abuse. With her that night was Jacqueline Moore, age 39, a friend who stood by her side. Jacqueline was more cautious of Boyette, aware of his reputation. She wanted to protect Alicia, but tragically, that decision put her directly in harm's way. The Emerald Sands Inn was not a glamorous stopover. Known as a cheap roadside motel, it was the kind of place where people came and went without questions, a setting that hid secrets behind every closed door. On January 31st, 2017, Room 107 became the center of a brutal double homicide. That evening, Alicia and Jacqueline checked into the motel. Alicia was still deeply involved with Boyette, but their relationship was strained. Witnesses would later suggest that Boyette was growing paranoid, feeling as though people were turning against him. Jacqueline, meanwhile, acted as a protective friend, someone who saw danger and didn't want Alicia to face it alone. But Boyette didn't come alone. By now, he had convinced Mary Rice, a woman described by many as a reluctant accomplice, to help him. Whether out of fear or loyalty, Mary was now firmly part of his plans. Sometime in the night, Boyette entered the room. What happened next was merciless. Alicia Greer and Jacqueline Moore were both shot and killed at close range. There was no escape, no chance to run. The women never made it out of that motel alive. The brutality was staggering. 2 women trapped in a room with a man who believed he had nothing left to lose. And by his side, Mary Rice silent, watching and soon fleeing with him into the night. The next morning, a motel worker discovered the bodies. Word spread quickly, and fear rippled through the community. Who could kill 2 women in such cold blood? Investigators soon had their answer. Billy Boyette. He was already known to law enforcement. Violent, dangerous. Now, with 2 women dead, he became the focus of a statewide manhunt. The loss of Alicia Greer and Jacqueline Moore sent shockwaves through Milton and beyond. Alicia left behind children who would never see their mother again. Jacqueline's family struggled to understand how an ordinary night could end in such horror. Their names became the first to etched into the bloody trail left behind by Boyette and Rice. And this was only the beginning. Just days later, more lives would be taken, and the manhunt for Boyette and Rice would grow more desperate. The motel murders of Alicia Greer and Jacqueline Moore marked the start of a spree unlike anything Florida and Alabama had seen in years. For investigators, it was a race against time. For the victims' families, it was the start of a nightmare that would never fully end. By the time investigators discovered the bodies of Alicia Greer and Jacqueline Moore inside the Emerald Sands, and Billy Boyette and Mary Rice were already long gone. Their trail of violence wasn't cooling down, it was heating up, and their next victim was someone far too close to Boyette himself. Her name was Peggy Phillips. Peggy Bras was 37 years old, a mother, a sister, and a woman who had been tangled in Boyette's orbit for years. Peggy knew Billy. She had been in a relationship with him at one point, and that history made her a target. Investigators would later believe that Boyette feared Peggy could betray him, or perhaps he simply wanted to silence another woman tied to his violent past. Peggy wasn't afraid of Billy, but she knew how dangerous he could be. She told me once that if anything ever happened to her, it would be because of him. It still gives me chills. After killing Alicia Greer and Jacqueline Moore, Boyette and Rice needed another car, another place to hide, and someone to control. They were running out of options, and Boyette, paranoid and unhinged, turned his attention to Peggy Bras. On February 3, 2017, Peggy Bras's life came to a sudden and violent end. She was sitting in her car when Billy Boyette confronted her. Neighbors would later recall hearing shouting, then the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Peggy Bras was shot and killed, execution style. Her body was discovered shortly after. For investigators, it confirmed what they already feared. Boyette and Rice were spiraling further out of control, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Boyette's violence followed a chilling pattern. The first 2 murders were about control: Alicia Greer, his girlfriend, and Jacqueline Moore, who was collateral damage. Peggy Bras was different. Peggy knew his past. She was someone who could potentially expose him, and to a man like Boyette, that was unacceptable. By silencing Peggy, Boyette wasn't just eliminating a perceived threat. He was escalating his reign of terror, pulling Mary Rice deeper into complicity. With Peggy Braz's murder, the manhunt intensified. Law enforcement agencies across Florida and Alabama coordinated efforts to capture the fugitives. But Boyette and Rice weren't slowing down. They were desperate, dangerous, and unpredictable. And their story was far from over. By the second week of February 2017, Billy Boyette and Mary Rice had already left a trail of destruction across Florida. 3 women were dead, families shattered, and the couple was now officially fugitives, the focus of one of the most intense manhunts in the Southeast. But despite the walls closing in, Boyette wasn't finished. And tragically, one more innocent life would be taken before it was over. This is the story of Kayla Crocker. Kayla Crocker was just 28 years old, a young mother full of energy, with a wide smile and a heart devoted to her child. Friends described her as sweet, loving, and determined. She worked hard and lived a quiet life in Beulah, a small community west of Pensacola. Her focus was simple: providing for her son and giving him a safe, happy childhood. But on February 6, 2017, the quiet neighborhood where she lived would become the site of a horrific crime. After days on the run, Billy Boyette and Mary Rice needed another vehicle. Their stolen cars had either been ditched or traced by law enforcement, and the couple knew investigators were closing in. So Boyette set his sights on another victim, someone local, vulnerable, and living in a home that looked accessible. The house he chose belonged to Kayla Crocker. In the early hours of February 6, Billy Boyette and Mary Rice entered Kayla's home. Whether she was targeted by chance or whether Boyette had scoped out her house remains uncertain. What is known is this: once inside, Boyette attacked. Kayla was shot, left critically wounded, while her young son was present in the home. Miraculously, the boy was not harmed, but he would be left alone in the aftermath, his mother bleeding, his world shattered. Later that morning, Kayla's mother, worried after not hearing from her, stopped by the house. What she found was every parent's worst nightmare. Kayla was barely alive, clinging to life. She was rushed to the hospital, but despite doctors' efforts, she would later succumb to her injuries. Kayla Crocker became the final victim of Billy Boyette's killing spree. By this point, law enforcement was in full crisis mode. 3 women had already been murdered, and now a 4th, Kayla Crocker, was dead. The murders weren't just random acts of violence. They were a string of killings with no clear boundaries, stretching from Milton to Beulah, and investigators feared Boyette would strike again at any moment. Sheriffs from Escambia County and surrounding areas issued stark warnings. One official even said, "Billy Boyette is a cold-blooded killer. If you see him, do not approach, call 911. He is armed and dangerous." As for Mary Rice, investigators still weren't certain how much of a role she was playing. Was she a hostage, a reluctant accomplice, or a willing partner in crime? Regardless, the couple was on the run together, and the public was terrified. In Escambia County, people were on edge. Homes were locked tight, neighbors called to check on each other. Women especially felt unsafe, because Boyette's victims were all female, and the attacks seemed almost indiscriminate. One resident later recalled, "It felt like he could show up anywhere, anytime. We didn't sleep, we were just waiting." After Kayla Crocker's murder, Boyette and Rice fled once again, stealing Kayla's car and crossing the border into Alabama. But this time, their escape wouldn't last long. Law enforcement agencies in both Florida and Alabama were coordinating, determined to bring the manhunt to an end. The spree was entering its final act. For Kayla Crocker's family, the tragedy was overwhelming. A young mother, full of life and love, stolen in an instant. Her death marked the final chapter in Billy Boyette's spree, but not the end of the fear, or the destruction he left behind, because the very next day, the manhunt would reach its violent conclusion. By February 7, 2017, the manhunt for Billy Boyette and Mary Rice had reached a breaking point. For a week, the Southeast had been gripped in fear. 3 women were dead, another critically injured, and the killers had slipped through roadblocks, state lines, and hundreds of officers on their trail. But now, in the small town of West Point, Georgia, The chase was coming to an end. The couple had been tracked to a Days Inn motel off the highway, and as law enforcement closed in, a tense standoff unfolded, one that would end in violence, desperation, and finality. Law enforcement had received a crucial tip. Boyette and Rice were holed up in a motel room on the second floor of the Days Inn. They had checked in using cash and false information, but their car, one of the vehicles stolen earlier in the spree, gave them away. For days, officers had been racing to predict the killer's next move. But here, finally, was their chance to contain them. The area was quickly surrounded. Local police, SWAT units, and U.S. Marshals descended, determined not to let Boyette slip away again. Inside that motel room, the atmosphere was suffocating. Boyette, armed and paranoid, paced near the window. Rice, exhausted and frightened, knew the end was near. Around 2:30 p.m., the first calls came over the motel phone. Negotiators tried to reason with the pair. "Billy, it's over. There's nowhere left to run. We don't want anyone else to get hurt. Come out peacefully, and let's end this without bloodshed." But Boyette wasn't listening. He ranted, shouted, and refused to surrender. His voice carried through the walls, loud enough that nearby guests could hear the anger in his tone. Mary Rice, meanwhile, grew quieter. She wasn't holding a gun. She wasn't issuing threats. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, trembling, as the hours dragged on. Negotiators tried to drive a wedge between the two. They believed Mary Rice might surrender if given the chance, but Boyette had an iron grip on her, mentally, emotionally, and physically, and that grip wasn't about to loosen. As the standoff stretched past its second hour, the situation grew more volatile. Police evacuated surrounding rooms. Sharpshooters positioned themselves outside. Every officer knew Boyette had nothing left to lose. For Boyette, this wasn't about escape anymore. It was about control, about going out on his own terms. Inside, the motel room was charged with dread. Mary Rice cried quietly. She told Boyette she didn't want to die. Witnesses later reported that she had begged him to let her go, to walk out with her hands up. But Boyette only sneered. As the fourth hour approached, negotiators made one final attempt. A pause, a silence so heavy that even the officers outside held their breath. Then, a single gunshot. Boyette had turned the gun on himself, ending his life instantly. Within moments, the motel door creaked open. A terrified Mary Rice stepped out, hands raised, tears streaking her face. Officers swarmed in, pulling her to safety. She was taken into custody without resistance. After 8 days of terror, the killing spree was finally over. Billy Boyette was dead, and Mary Rice, the woman who had followed him from crime scene to crime scene, was now alone and facing justice. The standoff had ended with no further loss of innocent life, but for the families of Alicia Greer, Jacqueline Moore, Peggy Phillips, and Kayla Crocker, the relief was bittersweet. Boyette had denied them the chance to see him stand trial, to face justice, to answer for the pain he caused. Mary Rice, however, would face the courts. Her role as accomplice, whether victim or willing participant, would become the center of heated debate. The standoff at the Days Inn was the final chapter in Boyette's violent spree. But for Mary Rice, and for the families left behind, it was only the beginning of another painful journey, the long road through the justice system. February 2017. The manhunt for Billy Boyette ended in a fiery blaze inside a Georgia motel room. But for the victims' families, and for the communities of Florida and Alabama, the end of the chase was only the beginning of a long, painful healing process. Billy Boyette was dead, but the scars he left behind ran deep. For women were gone, dozens of lives were forever shattered, and questions still lingered about the woman who had been at his side from the very beginning. Mary Rice. After the standoff, Mary Rice was taken into custody without injury. She now stood at the center of a storm. Was she a hostage, forced into compliance by an abusive and controlling man? Or was she a willing accomplice, aiding Boyette in his deadly spree? The prosecution wasted no time. In their eyes, Mary Rice had every opportunity to leave Billy Boyette. She had driven the getaway cars. She had rented hotel rooms. She had bought supplies. And through it all, she had chosen to stay by his side. But her defense team painted a very different picture. They described a woman trapped in a cycle of fear and psychological control, manipulated into following Boyette, convinced that the only way to survive was to obey. Cases like Mary Rice's are complicated. Coercion is real. Victims of abuse sometimes act in ways that look like complicity, but are actually survival strategies. The question for the jury was, did Mary Rice have a choice? Meanwhile, the families of the women killed were left to grieve. Alicia Greer's loved ones mourned a young woman whose life was cut short by the man she thought she could trust. Jacqueline Moore's family remembered a loyal friend who paid the ultimate price for simply being in the wrong place, with the wrong person, at the wrong time. Peggy Phillips' family spoke of her kindness, her laughter, her dedication as a mother. And Kayla Crocker's family, blindsided by the sudden, senseless loss, struggled to comprehend how a quiet morning at home could turn into a nightmare. For them, the trials, the news coverage, the public fascination with Billy Boyette, all of it was salt in an open wound. In 2018, Mary Rice faced her reckoning in court. Prosecutors argued she was an active participant in the crimes. The defense argued she was under duress. After days of testimony, the jury returned its verdict. Mary Rice was guilty. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the victims' families, it was some measure of justice. But as many would later say, no sentence could ever undo the pain. The Boyette's killing spree remains one of the darkest chapters in recent Southern criminal history. It is a story not just of violence, but of manipulation, of control, and of the devastating ripple effect of abuse and crime. Billy Boyette is gone. Mary Rice will likely spend the rest of her life behind bars. But for the families of Alicia, Jacqueline, Peggy, and Kayla, the grief continues. When the headlines fade and the cameras turn away, what remains are the lives forever altered. The mothers without daughters, the children without mothers, the friends left with memories instead of moments. This was not just a story of a manhunt. It was the story of 4 women whose lives were stolen, and the countless loved ones left behind to carry their memory. And for many, it is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't just come with a gun in hand. It can come in the form of control, coercion, and the silence of those too afraid to speak until it is too late. The manhunt was over. Billy Boyette was dead. Mary Rice was behind bars. The 4 women whose lives were stolen had been memorialized. Yet, the story didn't end with the courtroom verdicts or the standoff. The ripples of their actions and the consequences are still felt today. For the families of the victims, the healing process is ongoing. Alicia Greer's loved ones continue to honor her memory through scholarships and community work. Jacqueline Moore's friends remember her acts of kindness through annual vigils. Peggy Phillips' family advocates for awareness about domestic violence. And Kayla Crocker's child grows up surrounded by stories that keep her mother alive in memory. Though justice in a courtroom was served, it cannot replace what was lost. The emotional scars, the grief, and the questions left behind are enduring reminders of how deeply one person's actions can affect countless lives. Mary Rice's trial sparked debate about the boundaries between coercion and culpability. Legal experts noted her situation as a cautionary tale. Victims of psychological control can appear complicit even when acting out of fear. Her conviction, life without parole, highlights the legal system's attempt to balance accountability with recognition of coercion. But it also raises ethical questions about how society interprets survival under duress. The Boyette spree also left a mark on law enforcement and public awareness. Multi-state coordination, rapid response, and public vigilance were all essential in ending the threat. But beyond procedures and protocols, the case prompted conversations about early warning signs in abusive relationships, the importance of reporting suspicious behavior, and the need for community vigilance. Ultimately, the legacy of this tragic story is twofold. First, it is a stark reminder of the consequences of violence, manipulation, and unchecked abuse. Second, it is the enduring memory of 4 women who mattered, whose lives continue to inspire lessons about compassion, vigilance, and remembrance. Billy Boyette and Mary Rice's story is over, but the lessons for families, communities, and society remain. Awareness, empathy, and action are the steps we can take to ensure that the memories of those lost are never forgotten, and that their stories help prevent tragedies in the future. What true crime case has stuck with you or kept you up at night? Let us know in the comments. Your suggestion might be featured in an upcoming episode.